everyone prepares you for the hard part of moving abroad. There are whole books, subreddits, group chats, YouTube videos, and influencer stories built around exactly one fear: landing somewhere new, not knowing the language, and not knowing where anything is, or maybe not even knowing anyone, and no one knowing you. Here's what nobody prepares you for. That's not the hard part of moving abroad, living abroad. It never was. The hard part is the flight back. Not that flight leaving home, but the flight that returns you home. I'm Kiara, and this is Put the Guidebook Down. 2 episodes ago, I told you that you don't need to find yourself abroad because you build one. New place, no scaffolding, nobody around you who already decided who you were and holding you in check for that. And that's the part that most of us get. It's the part that people actually talk about and why you hear that you find yourself abroad in all media and travel-related merchandise. What nobody talks about is what happens when that built self that you made abroad has to come back home into the room that's exactly the same as when you left it, with the people who are exactly the same as when you left them. You'd think coming home is the easy leg of the trip. You already speak the language, you know where the grocery store is, you've got a bed that isn't a hostel bunk. By every logical measure, home should be the recovery, not the relapse, and most certainly not the stressful part of your journey. Except that's not what the research says, and it's not actually what happens to most people who've lived somewhere else long enough to change. Coming home doesn't feel like landing. It feels like starting over, except this time nobody around you thinks you need to. And you feel like that moment when a child is trying to stick a circle peg into a square peg and it's just not working. It just doesn't feel right. Home doesn't feel like it used to because you've changed while the rest of your home environment has stood still in a way. That gap between what re-entry should feel like and what it actually feels like has a name, and it's been documented since the 1960s. It's just never part of the story anyone tells you before you book the flight, study abroad, or start a new program. So let's change that, starting with why coming home is actually a second dip and not the finish line. There's a model in cross-cultural psychology called the U-curve, and it describes the shape of adjusting to a new culture. You land, you're excited, that's the high point, and then reality sets in. The paperwork, the loneliness, the days where nothing makes sense. Essentially, the hype from the trip is beginning to fade, and you start to crave something new or a change, and you move on. Then slowly you climb back out of that pit and you adjust. That's the U-shape. In 1963, researchers John and Jean Gullahorn looked at what happens after that U closes. When people actually go home and found the shape doesn't actually stop there. It happens again. A second excitement, a second dip, arguably a harder one, on the way back in. 2 U's connected. They called it the W curve. And that second dip is the part nobody plans for because on paper, it shouldn't exist. You're not adjusting to somewhere unfamiliar. You're going back to the place you're supposedly from and already super familiar with. But a researcher named Workman, who spent years studying Americans returning from living overseas, found something that should stop you in your tracks, make you pause, make you think. People who had lived abroad consistently said that leaving home and figuring out an entirely new country was less stressful than the jolt of coming back into their own home and daily lives. Let's rewind that. Let's listen to that again. Because building a life from nothing in a language you didn't grow up speaking or maybe don't even know was rated as easier than unpacking a suitcase in your home. And you may be thinking like, have I experienced this? What is she talking about? But let me explain. I've had this feeling. My friends and colleagues have had this feeling. We've actually talked about this feeling on this show several episodes ago. However, at the time, we called it reverse culture shock. And that's the term I've actually had a program admin use to explain this feeling to me. In a way, it's kind of right because it is to some degree reverse culture shock because you're adjusting to cultural differences, relearning habits and routines, etc. I'll explain more later. But on the other hand, it's not the entire explanation of what's actually happening. It's just another part of the W curve. I experienced this W curve. It was exciting to come back home, to see my family and close friends again in person. To be in my own bed was a huge plus after backpacking and staying in hostels with not the best conditions, let's face it. So you're excited in this phase because everyone else is excited to have you back and they want to hear all about your trip and your travels. But then the hype dies down for those around you, and the excitement that you felt being back home fades as you start re-entering your routine. Except you don't fit into that routine in exactly the same way that you had before. You're re-looking for that feeling of excitement again, reflecting on how you felt during your time abroad and feeling the need to get back to it. You're chasing that feeling and just feeling like that circle peg in a square again. So why home can feel like belonging nowhere at times? The W curve tells you the shape of the dip. It doesn't tell you what's actually happening inside of it. For that, there's a term from a psychologist with a name that I'm definitely going to mispronounce, called Shijem Kajichibashdi, who studies cross-cultural adaptation, deculturation. It's not homesickness, and it's not just being out of practice that you're feeling. Deculturation is a specific state of having partially lost that automatic fluency you used to have in your own culture. The unwritten rules, the small talk, the rhythms, what counts as normal, without having fully swapped in the fluency of the place you just left either. You're not fully of the place you came back to, and you're not still at the place you left. For a while, you're not fluent in either one, and you're kind of in this weird in-between with mixed-match aspects of each of the two, and trying to piece the parts of your culture with the culture that you begin to immerse and adapt aspects of while abroad. And that's what makes it so disorienting to come back home. Nobody expects you to feel like a foreigner in the grocery store they grew up going to. You expect that friction abroad. You've braced for it. You've mentally prepared for it. You have no scaffolding for feeling like a stranger in your own kitchen. That's the discomfort. That's the disorientation. This point kind of relates more to the reverse culture shock in that you're relearning and trying to find a way to bridge who you were before you left and with who you are from coming abroad, with that new version of you together merging both parts, which is essentially just a blend of all of it. And it's complicated to navigate internally, especially if you don't have anyone who can relate to this feeling. So you're just like, is it just me? When it's not. And if you don't feel some internal tension or complication when you're moving back home and readjusting, then I'm going to challenge it and say that you didn't really immerse fully into the place you were. For me, this has been expressed internally and externally in different ways. In a more funny story, I was talking aloud about one of the moments where I had some stomach illness abroad and sharing details of the experience while in the middle of a retail store once I had come back from living in Indonesia. In the middle of the story, I had noticed that more and more people were looking at me or listening to my story. At the end, I had realized that the majority of the people around me spoke English because I'm back in the States and could understand what I was saying. Whereas I previously was used to being able to get away with speaking English because people could not understand really what I was saying and could then just tell embarrassing stories in English really wherever I was. So it was kind of a funny reality check for me to remember that I was back home and this is the common language in my community. So that's just like a funny example of blending the two instances. But on a more serious note, this deculturation was felt with how I greet people, rules of small talk, and societal norms that I had adopted for my host communities that didn't fit with the American status quo. At one point, I was shocked, like, wow, we are very loud and rude with how we address people in American culture. Whereas in Indonesia, I was always addressing people with proper titles. There was no conflict in public, and just being really respectful with how you approach conversations and vocabulary. And so this all leads into this question of why the hardest part isn't the feeling, but it's what you do with this now that you're aware of what this feeling is. And in 2000, a researcher named Kevin Goss studied college students who had just come back from time abroad and measured something specific: how much reverse culture shock they reported and what happened to them because of it. Students with higher reverse culture shock reported more personal adjustment problems, more shyness, and that part isn't surprising. Here's the part that should sound familiar. If you caught my episode of Nobody Knew My Name, those same students, the ones struggling the most, were less likely to reach out for help. Not more, less. And that's the self-isolation response again that we had talked about in the episode. Same coping pattern that showed up when a disrupted sense of self hit during the trip is showing up a second time, but on the way back in. And the exception is this time it's quieter because nobody around you thinks you need checking in. You're home. You're supposed to be fine. The people who might have noticed when you were struggling abroad from your support network knew you were somewhere else and adjusting, which may be difficult. The people around you now, maybe that same support network, just see someone from a nice trip 3 weeks late on unpacking, a little quiet, and they have no reason or feeling to ask, are you okay? Because they're at home. Of course they're okay. But when you put the three of these together, here's what they explain that no single one does alone. The shape of the dip with the W curve, what's actually happening in it, the deculturation, and why it goes largely unaddressed, even though it's measurable and documented via GAW. Re-entry isn't a mood. It's a second identity threat, and it runs on the same isolation instinct as the first one, just aimed at a room that has no idea anything happens. So let's get deep and reflect here a little. If the version of you abroad was something you built and re-entry is this documented second harder dip, whose fault is that dip really? The easy answer is you changed and you just have to get used to being back and getting into routine. And I don't think that's right. And it's something that I have been told numerous times. And I would say it's not the whole thing. It's not the whole explanation. Here's what's actually happening. You come home changed, the room didn't. Your coworkers still expect the same person who left. Your family had a role for you that got set before the trip and maybe your whole life and never got updated even though you had updated. Nobody around you sat through the construal distance, the self-expansion, any of the actual mechanism that you had experienced. They just see you, apparently the same, and that's not their fault. But they expect you to slot back in like nothing happened. The gap between who you became and who everyone around you is still addressing is where the second identity threat actually lives. It's not dramatic. It doesn't happen in an airport. It happens 3 weeks later when someone asks how the trip was for the 5th time and the real answer doesn't fit anywhere in the question. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone about whose fault it is that maybe you're feeling this way or no one's realizing this is the feeling, because as a society, we just don't talk about this. Maybe because we don't know, maybe it's taboo, maybe just we need to do a better job. And this is where this show is about. So I'm not going to tell you that time fixes this, because for a lot of people, it doesn't. It just gets negotiated down deeper and deeper inside until the built version of you quietly gives way to the one that everyone already expects. I personally relate and feel very deeply towards the subject, so we're going to go more deeper into that last few points in a later episode, but here's what I'd actually ask you to sit with instead. Think about what would have to change at home and in you for that person you became somewhere else to actually survive coming back. Who would need to know something changed? What would you need to do to stop pretending it didn't? And how can we effectively merge these different aspects of us when coming back with this new version that we built versus the shell that we left behind? Because leaving was never the hard part. Nobody warns you about the part after the airport, the second time when coming home. I'm Kiara. This is Put the Guidebook Down. Guidebooks tell you where to go. We're here for why you went. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.